right. Hello, everyone. Mr. Zagari here. Hello, APUSH Nation.
Mr. O'Hagan here from the second floor Situation Room.
And I'm in the underground bunker here. And we are coming to you with a little bit of the interwar years. We decided to give you a little PowerPoint presentation of the interwar years as we give a little prelude to World War II.
Yeah, and we didn't want you to get bored over February break. So here's a little something to keep the juices flowing.
The APUSH, we don't want you to miss us too much over this week off. So here's a little something for you. Okay. So as always, we wanted to give you a little bit of context. As the United States during this time period of the interwar years, we're looking 1919 through 1939, and the U.S. is looking to return to normalcy, a time of post-World War I. They're looking to deregulate deregulate governmental intervention, as seen in the progressive era, and most notably go back to a neutral state as it pertains to foreign policy, as we have seen with the Senate refusing to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and moving away from the internationalist views of Woodrow Wilson and of collective security and that notion with the League of Nations. Today, what we're going to look at are the events that are going to move the United States to war by 1941. So Mr. O'Hagan is going to take us away here with our first slide on foreign policy. Mr. O?
All right. Well, as Mr. Zagari just mentioned, this notion of Wilson's being an internationalist, by the time we get to the 30s and Franklin Roosevelt is in the White House, we have to remember that Roosevelt was himself a Wilsonian. He actually served in Woodrow Wilson's administration as the Undersecretary of the Navy. He was a strong supporter of the 14 Points and the League of Nations. So Franklin Roosevelt's worldview is not as a neutralist. He's not a 20s, let's return to normalcy guy. He's an internationalist. But he wants America involved, but it's the economy, it's the Depression. That's what really is motivating his policy as president in the 1930s. For example, as you see in that beautiful image right there, his good neighbor policy towards Latin America, which, side note, looks suspiciously like the policy that Hoover was actually following and historically doesn't get a lot of credit for. But anyway, FDR's good neighbor policy was really a follow-up to the notion of the moral diplomacy that we saw Woodrow Wilson emphasizing. And it's fair to say that happy neighbors also make better trading partners, something that during the Depression really informed a lot of the foreign policy that Roosevelt embraced. What can we do to make allies, economic allies, out of people instead of making them antagonistic towards the United States? And especially with what's going on in Europe at the time, as Zags is going to cover in detail in a moment, if Germany and Italy get a little ornery, this gives Roosevelt a better diplomatic relationship with neighbors in the hemisphere, and maybe that whole notion of collective security is a little bit of what Roosevelt is playing at here as well. Also noteworthy is that it's in this era, 1934 specifically, that Roosevelt formally recognized the Soviet Union. And he's going to say, unlike his predecessors during the 20s, they all refused, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, they all refused to recognize the Soviets. For FDR, it's economic. Let's recognize them, let's normalize relationships, and then we can sell goods to them, right? And we can buy stuff. So it's, again, economically motivated. And think of where the Soviets are, right? Having an ally in Europe with the Germans and the Italians on the march, that's not a bad idea either. Last key point I'll make is that during this era, we've got Roosevelt, who's also opposed to high tariffs, because to him, high tariffs are bad business. It costs American companies because foreign companies are going to put high tariffs on our goods coming in. And again, all of his foreign policy we can see in this era really driven by economics primarily, and secondarily, he's trying to build better relationships with countries in case things go bad, and in case he's got to rely on friends if the Germans and the Italians, really start to put pressure on the United States or other countries. So he's still got that collective security idea in his mind. It's driven by economics, but it's still very much in keeping with what Wilson would have talked about. All right, let's move on to Europe, Zags.
Okay, here we go. So what we see in the Depression, as Mr. O was just saying, and how our relationship is going to revolve around economics. Economics are also going to play the biggest role in the rise of fascism in Europe. The Depression that hit in 1929 was not isolated in the United States, and nations like Italy and Germany felt extreme resentment with the peace treaty of World War I. Italy installed fascist dictator Benito Mussolini, also known as El Duce, the leader, as he was called, in 1922. And what fascism is it's extreme authoritarian rule based on hyper-nationalism and militarism with extreme regimented society and expansionist tendencies. Italian fascists were made up of disgruntled war vets, nationalists, and those who feared a rise in communism in Italy. Communism and fascists were on complete polar opposite sides of the spectrum. But what we have to remember here is why they are on complete polar opposite sides of the spectrum. They're almost so far apart that they're almost coming back together again with their authoritarian rule. While that's going on in Italy, Germany, on the other hand, the end of the war and the peace treaty left the nation in economic turmoil, and with strong national resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazi Party arose. Nazi leader Adolf Hitler was taking notes from Mussolini and installed a form of fascism in Germany that would also use extreme nationalism as the basis for his fascist ideology to increase his popularity amongst the unemployed German workforce. In addition to Hitler's ultranationalism and militarism, he also instituted tactics against Jews and communists in Germany. And by 1933, Hitler gained control of Germany and adopted the moniker the Führer, which is similar to El Duce, the leader. Nationalism and militarism was also prevalent in Asia as well, as we saw the basis that increased the power to the Empire of Japan that was rising with this same notion. And with poor economic conditions in Japan and the need for these raw materials as they have become an industrialized and militarized country, the Japanese would invade neighboring China. And it was only a matter of time that these totalitarian machines would see a world at war. So what we see here in these pictures, we see Hitler, we see Mussolini, and we also see the rise of these Japanese totalitarian regimes. And also with militarism and extreme nationalism, we also start to see extreme racism as part of this as well. So now let's move on to as these fascists are coming together, we're now seeing this march of aggression.
And I'll just piggyback something quick on that, Zags, which is that, you know, we've been talking about the impact of the Depression domestically on the United States. Well, here's the impact of the Depression on these other countries. And it's one of the reasons that Roosevelt was so concerned. It's why so many of the leaders were so concerned in America, because they saw these kinds of governments taking root in other places. And Roosevelt's fear was that if we didn't get our economic house in order, that is very, very easy for us to have fallen into this same trap. Roosevelt famously said to an advisor in a discussion they were having, the advisor said to Roosevelt, you know, Mr. President, if this New Deal works, you will go down as the greatest president in history. And Roosevelt's response was, and if it doesn't work, I might go down as the last one. So he was very conscious of the fact that these were the developments taking place in other parts of the world. And we were desperate. He was desperate to find a system that would work, to find a way to stop the bleeding in America's economy, because this was, you know, this was a realistic possibility of what could happen in America.
And that's why he was so open to this experimentation of all these different types of New Deal programs, where if one didn't work, he would try something else. And if that didn't work, he would try something else. And it was a constant change that he was willing to do to try to figure something out that would help the United States economy to start showing some signs of life again.
Yeah, you almost feel like he's always looking over his shoulder while he's trying to figure out what's going on in America and saying, hey, look what's going on over there. We really have to figure this out, guys.
Right. Okay. All right, let's go on with the march.
Okay, so you see on the left-hand side there all of these different events that are taking place in the era. Each one of these actions right, by these fascist totalitarian governments, whether it's the Italians or the Germans or the Japanese. Every one of them has a response from America, right? And we call them the Neutrality Acts, the Neutrality Act of 35, 36, 37. At the end of the day, what's important, I think, about this is to recognize the language. Their neutrality, but it's neutrality that's very directed. The Neutrality Act of 35, for example, says that the United States will not allow the sale of armaments to any belligerent country. Now, you read between the lines. We won't sell to a belligerent country. But what about a country that's defending itself? Okay, it leaves the door open for doing that. We won't loan money or give credit to any country, any belligerent country. But it leaves the door open for us loaning money or giving credit to a country that's acting in its own defense or the defense of somebody else, right? So what I think we need to understand here is that Roosevelt, the internationalist, recognizes how things are unfolding in Europe. And he's trying to slowly position the United States to be in a position where, if need be, just like in World War I, if we've got to come to the aid of the Allies, he wants to kind of walk our policy slowly to a position where we're going to be able to do that. And we're going to see in this next slide that Mrs. Zagari is going to highlight exactly how that transition, how he starts to walk us even more directly into a path where, even though we're neutral, we're clearly on one side, just as we were in World War I, a neutral party. But all throughout, 1914, 16, we clearly were leaning towards the British and the French and away from the Germans. All right, let's go to the next slide, Zach.
Okay, and like Mr. O'Hagan was saying about FDR being the internationalist, when he was working with the Wilson administration, he gave over 800 speeches in support of Wilson's League of Nations. And what we're going to see is he is going to walk, like Mr. O'Hagan is just saying, walk the United States slowly into, not into the war, but into more of the side of the Allies. And we see this with our first notion here of cash and carry, where FDR whipped the Neutrality Acts with cash and carry, which would allow a nation to buy U.S. arms if they paid cash and use their own ships to transport them. And FDR was aware of the British having the control of the seas and being able to buy these weapons from the United States and being able to ship them. And then he's going to expand off of this with his notion of the arsenal of democracy. And this arsenal of democracy, which is very similar to make the world safe for democracy, playing off of Wilson's idea of how Wilson was transforming the United States, transitioning the United States into a state of war during World War I. And FDR is going to expand off of cash and carry with Lend-Lease. And again, playing off of he knows who the belligerent nations are and defending themselves. And what you see here is that by the time he institutes Lend-Lease, you have the Battle of Britain happening, where Britain is the last democratic nation, so to speak, and they're defending themselves because France has fallen and Hitler has his eyes on the British. And by this point in time, with the Lend-Lease Act, FDR is lending and leasing and not worrying about the monetary value that the British don't have to pay right away for any weapons that they're using. And moreover, the United States are escorting any of these ships and weapons all the way to Iceland, as far as Iceland, and they're using a notion of, shoot on sight. If they see a German U-boat, our destroyers are going to try to blow it right out of the water. So clearly, we are starting to see a transition here where FDR is now bringing this notion that it's our moral responsibility to defend these four freedoms. And he gives this notion of the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. And that it's our moral obligation to help defend those nations from those actions. And he is now transitioning America into that ideology. Anything else you want to add to that, Mr. O'Hagan?
Just, I think your point is well taken, and that is that every time some event like cash and carry comes literally 3 weeks after Germany invades Poland and the war begins. Right, September 1st is the invasion of Poland, and I think it's the end of September 20th, 21st, somewhere in there.
Yeah, 39. Yeah,
but that's where he announces the cash and carry policy at a joint session of Congress. So every time an action takes place on the part of these belligerent countries, there is a reaction from Roosevelt, which kind of just moves us a little further away from the Germans and a little closer to the British and the French. And again, the Lend-Lease Act, once the British are standing alone by themselves, that's when he likens it to the whole idea of loaning. What's the analogy?
The quote is, I have it written down right here. Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire, and I have the length of a garden hose 400 or 500 feet away. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him put out his fire. I didn't say to him before the operation, neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it. I don't want $15. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over.
So he definitely sees the United States as taking on this role of assisting a good friend, a neighbor, against something that's dangerous. In this case, the fire is the representation of, Germany and the
Nazi
threat.
aggression, sure. Yep.
Right? Now, all of this, of course, is unfolding, and we're getting closer and closer until we have the big event. And the big event for the United States, drum roll, please. There you go.
And there we have it. At roughly 7:48 a.m., December 7th, 1941, the Japanese are going to launch an aerial bombardment of our Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor from this new weapon of war that both the United States and the Japanese are going to be using in the Pacific, and those are aircraft carriers. And the Japanese are going to launch this sneak attack against the American fleet, and it's going to catch us off guard to some extent. And our aircraft carriers are not there, but our battleships are there. And we're going to have roughly 3,000 sailors and civilians that are going to perish in this attack. And it's going to be the worst attack on the United States up until 9/11. And this, Roosevelt on December 8th, 1941 is going to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And this will thrust the United States into World War II by a deliberate attack from the Empire of Japan. And we're going to now transition our entire workforce, our entire military into a total war where everybody, men, women, children, are going to have to do their part in support of this, which is going to be the largest war in history.
There's a controversy surrounding Pearl Harbor that's kind of percolated under the surface for years. And there have been those who have accused Franklin Roosevelt of knowing the attack was coming and using it as an excuse to get America into the war. And the reason that people read it that way is because when you look back at the moves, and you can almost think of it as like a chessboard, the moves that Roosevelt is making, right, to bring us a little closer to the British, step by step, a little further away from the Germans, you'd have to say, well, it makes sense that this would be the next step. But it's not how it happened. All the intelligence reports are completely clear that though they were pretty concerned about a Japanese attack and were very, very tuned into the idea that the Japanese attack was imminent somewhere, the best intelligence suggested it was going to be the Philippines. Because that was an American possession, and it was very close to Japan. And the real shock was that the Japanese went as aggressive as they did. From the Japanese perspective, they thought if they hit Hawaii and really, cut out the Americans' heart and thought to themselves, my God, we don't want any part in this, that would give them a permanent extended sphere of influence in the Pacific. It had the absolute opposite effect. But the controversy, the conspiracies has lived on for years and years, but there's absolutely no merit to it. Roosevelt didn't know this was where the attack was going to happen. But what it demonstrates to me is clearly people look at this and they read back at the rest of the history and they say, look, you can see all of these moves that Roosevelt was making. Maybe they weren't obvious individually, but when you look at them collectively, the way a historian does, you start to see a pattern and you just assume that this was the natural next chess move. Just a side note, because it's one of those interesting moments in history that drew a lot of conspiracy theorists at the time. Like I said, largely debunked. I haven't read anybody serious whose opinion I consider noteworthy, who believes that there's a conspiracy. I've only read what I think are good reports that dismiss it entirely.
Right.
But I think it just demonstrates how clear it was that Roosevelt, the internationalist, saw a role for the United States. And P.S., spoiler, it shouldn't be a surprise that when the war is over, that the United Nations is created. And where is it located? Right here in the United States, in New York. Actually, they have the initial conference in San Francisco, but it ends up in New York. So that's kind of the legacy. Roosevelt was always intent on keeping America, getting America back onto the world stage. And even though he's gone, he's dead by the time the UN actually takes hold, Eleanor Roosevelt is actually instrumental in developing the Declaration of Human Rights. That's kind of the foundation of the UN. So his thumbprint is all over the post-war era too. And I think you can see his worldview clearly demonstrated by these events.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's a nice short overview.
There we go.
I don't know how short it was, but it's probably about 20 minutes.
20 minutes. I think we were right on our mark, Mr. O'Hagan, which is pretty good for us.
Yeah. We do tend to go on a little bit every so often.
Yeah.
But hopefully this will give us a good intro. So when we come back together on the first day back from break, we can look at Pearl Harbor as the event that kind of changes everything, changes public opinion, and spurs America to enter World War II.
All right, everyone. Mr. Zagari here. Have a great night.
Mr. O'Hagan here. See you on the other side of the February break.
Enjoy the week. We'll catch you soon. Have a good one.
Peace, love, and rock and roll.
There we go.